Welcome aboard the Pink Monorail podcast. My name is Noah. I'm normally the host of the Street Rider podcast where I talk about arcade games and fighting games. I'm also a huge Disney fan, and that's why I'm appearing on here. The usual hosts for the Pink Monorail are Shelly and Alice. They are recording new episodes while I'm filling in for this series on Disney in China. Today, we're going to look at the Shanghai Disneyland Resort. Any guest that wanted to experience the majesty of Disney's newest resort would be able to stay in one of two hotels. There was the budget-minded Toy Story Hotel, which was designed with families in mind. The theming at this hotel was especially perfect for families with young children. The double diamond shape looked like the number 8 from above. It was considered a lucky number in China. The 800-room, not a coincidence, hotel featured a courtyard with giant statues of the Toy Story characters for guests to pose with. The walls of the hotel were unique in that they were blue with soft white clouds painted on them. They were patterned after the walls in Andy's room in the Toy Story films. The family-friendly restaurant, the Sunnyside Cafe, was inspired by the preschool in Toy Story 3. Food trays were bright colors, the pattern on the carpets, paintings on the wall, and many other details were pulled right from the film. The courtyard featured an enormous Pizza Planet rocket that doubled as a water play area for kids, and even the driveway was covered with a long red canopy that looked like a Hot Wheels track. The Pixar films were popular in China to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars in box office receipts, and that love grew exponentially with each release. The characters were universally recognized as children's toys and, with the exception of the little green US Army men, provided little for the Chinese government to be alarmed about. The second hotel on Disney property was the Shanghai Disneyland Hotel. It had just over half the number of rooms as the Toy Story Hotel. It was a bit more upscale and designed with a more sophisticated taste in mind. The hotel had a distinct Art Nouveau aesthetic. It featured a fountain with a glass peony, columns gilded with brass ivy, and mosaic chandeliers. The indoor King Triton pool was covered from floor to ceiling with colorful tiles, recreating images from The Little Mermaid. The Aurora restaurant featured modern Asian cuisine. The animated masterpiece Fantasia had influenced the design of the Bacchus Lounge and Ballet Cafe. This was definitely the hotel for the booming middle class that wanted a top-tier experience. Both hotels had amenities that Chinese guests had come to expect. They set a standard for China-ready resorts from the company. Each had a selection of hot teas with their dining, but also tea in every room, along with slippers to change into while relaxing. As with every major Disneyland hotel, the mascot characters would be presented in statue form in and around the property. The polished golden statues at the Shanghai Disneyland Hotel told a story. From the porte cochere to the atrium, the Disney characters had arrived to mainland China in style. Mickey and Minnie could be seen in their finest evening wear. It seemed that the mascots would be performing a concert for the other guests. Small maquettes of the statues created for the hotel were previewed at the D23 in Anaheim. Each of the Disneyland hotels were set in their own era and each told a unique story. The artists, architects, planners, tailors, chefs, and sculptors working for Disney all helped make this story a reality. There was an insane amount of detail that went into the planning stages for each hotel, more so for the trademark Disneyland ones. Absolutely no detail was left to chance. The type of furniture, the fabric patterns, carpets, and even dinnerware selected for the restaurants all had to fit the same theme. The molding and paintings that hung in the rooms, and even the graphics printed on toiletries all reflected the same theme. A top-tier hotel anywhere in the world was expected to have the same level of detail. However, Disney seemed to go one step beyond guest expectations. The Disney company wanted to make sure that audiences were completely immersed in the experience, and in this case, felt like they were participants of this particular era. The Imagineers that designed the Tokyo hotels set a standard that was followed at Hong Kong and now Shanghai. The Disneyland Hotel in Tokyo was reflecting an era that happened almost parallel to the same era in the Shanghai Hotel. Mickey and his friends were dressed in late 19th century American fashion. These nifty 90s figures were even featured on hotel exclusive dolls and various soft goods. For the Hotel Miracosta, the mascots were presented as 14th century explorers. Each hotel carried these themes into each room. The Oriental Land Company was very aware of the cult of the Disney collector. Every product designed for the hotels would become desirable by the park visitors. In fact, the more rare the item, the greater the chance it would be hunted down by the Disney enthusiast. They made sure that the hotels were stocked with limited edition items and created new waves of merchandise almost as fast as they did in the parks. Whenever they did these things, they made sure that each item properly reflected the individual hotel. For example, did you know that guests that stayed in one of the 3 current Disney hotels in Japan could purchase collector luggage tags? Visitors could get their initials in metal or on a leather tag and get an additional Mickey Mouse tag with him dressed in the matching hotel uniform. These sorts of details would be brought over to China for the Hollywood Hotel and the Hong Kong Disneyland Hotel. For the Shanghai hotels, the Disney company would be creating 2 unique themes for their mascots. But the mascots would not be the only characters filling a role. Cast members would be receiving costumes that reflected the aesthetic for each hotel. For the Toy Story cast, each uniform was bright and colorful. Women had bright blouses in red and yellow, and men had overalls with patches. They looked like clothing designed to be played in. By contrast, the Shanghai Disneyland hotel uniforms were very upscale, form-fitting yet functional turn-of-the-century fashion. Interestingly enough, these would have been similar to the uniforms worn by the hotel workers when Walt Disney was born. The plans for the hotels were ambitious, yet something that the company had achieved time and time again. Visitors to the D23 Expo in Anaheim were given a preview of the Shanghai Park, the shops of Disneytown, and a preview of what was awaiting them in the hotels. Disney was betting big on Shanghai, but they were not the only corporation that was. Previously in the series, I mentioned that when Disneyland opened, a large number of hotels and motels sprang up around the property. Walt Disney did not appreciate that some poorly themed buildings would be adjacent to his park. They were killing the illusion that Walt was hoping to create, that Disneyland was far from the ordinary, and that it would be transporting people to a magical place. If Walt had more money, he would have bought more land and kept these hotels far away. It was exactly what he accomplished with his Florida property. The Disney Corporation did not have the same luxury in Shanghai. They got the largest lot they could, big enough for the massive park, the shopping complex, and hotels. It still had room for the park to expand and a generous bumper around the property of trees and lakes. Yet in typical speculator fashion, there would be other developers moving in. Unlike the cheap hotels that surrounded Disneyland 60 years ago, the stakes were much higher. Multi-million and multi-billion-dollar hotel properties were planned to entice visitors to stay just off-site. One of the most ambitious hotels was called the Atlantis Luxury Hotel. The Fosun Hotel Group wanted to open what they titled a 7-star resort near Shanghai Disneyland. There would be no mistaking the almost $2 billion property for one of the cheap hotels that Walt had to deal with several generations ago. The booming middle class, hungry for the best resort experience, would undoubtedly give this hotel serious consideration during their vacation plans. Having a few great choices for guests to stay at while visiting Disneyland was only the beginning of the Shanghai plans. In the next stop, the Pink Monorail will finally go through the gates and give our guests a tour of the new park. Across several parks, the Disney Company had created a number of unique elements for their visitors. In front of Tokyo Disneyland, Tokyo Disney Sea, and Hong Kong Disneyland, there were unique statues and fountains. Shanghai would be no exception. Before visitors could get to the gate, they would be greeted by Disney's biggest star. Mickey Mouse would be waving from a small paddle boat. The design was a blend of the classic Steamboat Willie version of the mouse with the modern proportions of the character. The boat would be suspended in the air by a fountain blast. It was a similar trick that Disney employed in Hong Kong by having Mickey on a surfboard stay aloft via a whale spout. Once visitors passed the fountain and the ticket booths, they would reach the main entrance. This entrance was completely different than those featured at any other Magic Kingdom inspired park. First off, there was no Mickey Mouse shaped flower garden at the front, nor were guests supposed to walk to a tunnel on either side of an elevated train platform. Instead, there was a large main tunnel and two smaller tunnels under the platform. This decision was more than likely done for the sake of Feng Shui, the philosophy of harmonizing architecture with nature. The placement and orientation of buildings and doors helped the flow of energy through a property. Fortune, or rather positive energy, could be gathered or lost depending on how plans were laid out. The garden in front of the platform would have completely destroyed the energy going into the park, at least in the eyes of many Chinese visitors. The other reason for the redesigned opening was based on the number of visitors anticipated during peak seasons. There was much more room outside and inside the park to accommodate thousands of guests arriving hourly via subway, bus, or car. Something else that was unique about the new entrance was the platform itself. The architecture was Art Nouveau, with accents created in the French iron style. It was carrying over themes from the Disneyland Hotel. Atop the entrance were golden accents cut in the shape of Tinkerbell as she sprinkled pixie dust over the guests. The clock on the tower was unique as well. It was an oversized version of the classic Ingersoll Mickey Mouse watch. Something that surprised longtime Disneyland fans was the lack of a train circling the perimeter. There was still a berm built around the park to block the view of the outside world, but there would be no steam train circling the property. Many speculated that this was a cost-cutting measure because the park construction was already behind schedule and over budget. However, it could also be a decision not to include a train because many of the Chinese parks, especially the classic gardens, celebrated nature and kept the transportation minimal. Visitors were used to walking to see all of the sights, and this would be no different. Down the road, perhaps in a decade, if Disney wanted to create a train or even trolley line to circle the property, there was room to build and a platform wide enough to accommodate one or even two lines. Once visitors passed through the entrance, they were not on Main Street. There was no plaza, no fire station, courthouse, or theater, as there was in Disneyland. The company was not trying to create the small town atmosphere of Marceline, Missouri. The visitors from mainland China would not have had a point of reference to the late Victorian architecture reminiscent of Walt Disney's childhood. Yet at the same time, the company had to present a snapshot of classic US culture for Chinese tourists. This portion of the park would feature architecture that appeared at least a century old, but well maintained to create a sense of history. The planning for Shanghai was more in tune with the World Bazaar in Japan than Main Street USA. The first portion of the park would be called Mickey Avenue. What made Mickey Avenue unique was the shop selection. Each store and restaurant had a proprietor that was a Disney mascot. Because of this, no two shops would be exactly the same. Each shop reflected the taste of the icons. Their personalities were assigned attributes that the Chinese would be able to identify with. Mickey Mouse represented hospitality. Minnie Mouse and Figaro the cat, compassion. Goofy, optimism. Donald Duck was worldly. Daisy Duck, friendliness. Pluto and Fifi, generosity, and Chip and Dale, friendship. The checkout area of the Avenue M Arcade, the largest shop in Shanghai Disneyland, was modeled after the first bank of Scrooge McDuck. The signs, billboards, and posters on Mickey Avenue featured cameos from dozens of classic films and animated shorts. There would also be a mix of statues, animatronics, and audio effects, as well as the patented Smell It Sir on some of the storefronts. Placing many of these details inside some of the shops would help convince the young guests that the icons really work there. The proprietors of each shop sold the appropriate items. For example, the French bakery was named Remy's Pâtisserie. Minnie Mouse ran the Sweethearts Confectionery, and inside the walls were adorned with photos of the biggest sweethearts, Mickey and Minnie Mouse. The Imagineers even planned international nods into Mickey Avenue. The gelato shop was called Il Paperino. Paperino was the name of Donald Duck in Italy. Paperino was a wildly popular character in the pages of Topolino, Mickey Mouse magazine. The USA had stopped and started its Disney comic brand many times over the years, but in Italy, the Disney comics have been continuously published for over 80 years. That's right, the Italian Disney comics had been around longer than the original Disneyland park. Even the dining areas had similar theming. The Mickey and Pals Market Cafe was a counter service restaurant that offered different areas, run by Daisy Duck, the Three Caballeros, and even Tony's Restaurant, the Italian restaurant from the film Lady and the Tramp. The blend of unique shops and architecture combined elements from Main Street USA, the World Bazaar, and even Buena Vista Street from Disney's California Adventure. When the shops were placed side by side, the entire area came to life. It would become very much like the Western equivalent of the popular shopping district Xintiandi. It was particularly important to have the very first portion of the park be dedicated to the mascots. It would help the tourists become familiar with the characters, especially since their likenesses would appear all over the park. The Disney company was anticipating that the booming middle class would visit the park in great numbers and make it a priority to pick up high-quality merchandise on Mickey Avenue. Tourists that visited the USA did a lot of retail shopping, but no group had done more over the past few years than the Chinese. The US Department of Commerce reported that Chinese tourists spent nearly $9 billion in the United States in 2012. That number had gone up over the years, with an estimated 2.6 million Chinese expected to visit the USA in 2015. In 2013, Chinese tourists spent an average of $5,647 per person per trip in the US, compared to all overseas visitors, who spent an average of $2,896 during the same era. That number grew in 2019. Despite a trade war, the U.S. Travel Association reported almost 3 million Chinese visitors spending an average of $6,700 per person. With a high-quality park in their own country, many tourists were expected to reconsider spending the money overseas. The International Trade Administration had some very strong forecasts for Chinese tourists. In 2015, they were expected to grow 20% and add an additional 3.6 million tourists by 2020, making it a 163% growth from just a few years ago. These tourists would be spending billions in the US and countless billions at home as well. The Disney parks, products, licensing, films, and television were expected to benefit from all that growth over the next few years. In anticipation of that, Mickey Avenue would be a bustling place of commerce, and only the first portion of the park. The heart, or rather hub, of Shanghai Disneyland would be even more unique. The pink monorail will make this the next stop. The center of Disneyland, whether in the USA, Paris, Tokyo, or Hong Kong, was known for two things. There was a hub that split in multiple directions and allowed guests to discover each themed land. It was also one of the prime spots to catch a parade. Shanghai would get the longest parade route of any park with the Mickey Storybook Express Parade, but more importantly, the center of Disneyland featured a castle. Shanghai would be getting the biggest and most interactive castle ever featured in any park. It was so massive that it had an attraction that would run underneath the building, Journey to the Crystal Grotto. The castle would also be the heart of the Ignite the Dream Nighttime Spectacular. This castle would be called the Enchanted Storybook Castle and would be the centerpiece of the most unique hub and fantasy land yet conceived. The hub actually was a themed area in and of itself. It would be known as the Gardens of Imagination. Think of the Gardens of Imagination as a classic park within a theme park. In the words of Bob Iger, it was authentically Disney and distinctly Chinese. Traditional Chinese parks featured well-manicured landscaping, statues, and water features. These could be very meditative places set in the middle of a sometimes chaotic amusement park. These gardens also provided guests, especially elderly visitors, with places to sit and keep an eye on the grandchildren. Chinese families had strong generational bonds, and the Disney company needed to ensure that their park would have very familiar features for guests. There were two main attractions in the Gardens of Imagination, a version of the Dumbo flying elephant and a carousel. Both were family friendly, but more important, they rekindled the inspirations behind the original Disneyland park. Walt Disney enjoyed spending time with his family and would often take his daughters to ride the merry-go-round at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. He would sit on a park bench and daydream about a place that would surpass the best parks in the world. One of the benches now resides in Disneyland, and the other at the Walt Disney Family Museum. Walt wanted someplace clean and inviting, something much more sanitized than the carnivals and boardwalks of the day. Walt would travel with his family and get a chance to experience some of the most unique parks and gardens the world had to offer. The Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, Denmark was one of Europe's longest running parks. Its unique architecture and landscaping were influential to the development of Disneyland. Even domestically, Walt would be influenced by some other parks, such as Knott's Berry Farm, run by his good friend Walter Knott. In Northern California, there was even a place whose DNA colored Fantasyland. Fairyland in Oakland, California opened in 1950, 5 years before Disneyland. It was also commonly known as the Storybook Park. It was very appropriate that the Gardens of Imagination featured an ornate carousel. It was themed after Fantasia, the animated concert feature. There were statues of Ben Alligator, Hyacinth Hippo, and Madame Upanova around the carousel. These were the respective alligator, hippopotamus, and ostrich featured in the Dance of the Hour sequence. The horses featured on the ride were modeled after the Pegasus from the Symphony No. 6 sequence in the film as well. Adorning the panels of the ride were paintings featuring the other scenes and characters from the movie. Honoring these characters would have made Walt proud. It would have also given families a welcoming atmosphere and sense of wonder. This park would have Western elements, but certainly be laid out in a way that made sense to Chinese tourists. The Gardens of Imagination also featured many wandering paths for visitors to explore. A garden maze themed after Alice in Wonderland would be featured next to the castle. The gardens were broken up into many themed sections. There was the Melody Garden, the Romance Garden, the Woodland Garden, the Garden of the Magic Feather, featuring the Dumbo attraction, the Fantasia Garden, which hosted the Fantasia Carousel, and the Storybook Castle Garden. This garden was located in front of the enchanted Storybook Castle and was a stage for shows. The garden would feature a mix of character meet and greets as well as statues for guests to take pictures with. Visitors from the south of China would count the number of gardens and realize that they were receiving a tremendous value for their money, whereas visitors from the north would note that the size of the gardens was where the value was. The decision to focus so much space and energy by the Disney Company on the Gardens of Imagination was a cultural reason. The classical Chinese garden was a staple in every major city. Several gardens went back centuries. They reflected different dynasties in many cases. Having a well-preserved garden was not only a tourist draw, but could also be considered a status symbol for an entire region. When one dynasty fell, the following dynasty will go out of their way to erase any record, temple, or building that celebrated the previous. Some of the remaining gardens survived the purge and were direct connections to history. The surviving gardens often had award-winning tea houses, restaurants, and world-renowned shows. The design and layout of each garden was unique, but there were some consistent themes. The placement of water features in relationship to the feng shui of the landscape, the selection and number of bridges, and even their layout all had a purpose. For example, did you know why some of the footbridges in classical Chinese construction were in a zigzag pattern? This was done so that any evil spirits trying to cross into a house would become confused and disoriented. Whether it was the popular Yuyuan Garden in Shanghai, mentioned much earlier in this series, or the UNESCO World Heritage List member classical gardens of Suzhou in Jiangsu, large ornate gardens with certain themes were distinctly Chinese symbols. The effort that the Disney Company put forward to honor the culture and history of the nation was apparent at every turn. One of the highlights of the Gardens of Imagination would be the Garden of the 12 Friends. This garden would feature the 12 animals from the Chinese zodiac, represented by Disney and Pixar characters. This garden actually had a big name sponsor, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China. This company may not be familiar to you. However, the ICBC was the biggest public company in the world. How big was it? It had over $4 trillion worth of assets as of 2017. By comparison, the Walt Disney Company held around $95 billion during the same period. The ICBC wanted to make sure that they were closely aligned with all the culturally positive elements in the park, and certainly something that would withstand the test of time. The Garden of 12 Friends would feature highly detailed tile murals of the Disney characters including Pluto, Remy, and Thumper, portraying a Chinese zodiac character. There were some religious parks in the USA and the aforementioned Noah's Ark Park in Hong Kong. The USA, in general, tended to keep religion, astrology, numerology, and mysticism out of corporate culture, and certainly out of the theme park industry. Yet these spiritual influences were intertwined with Chinese culture and as inseparable as the seasons of the year. The quality of the art featured inside and outside of the park would set a new standard for the resorts. The best artists in the company, including those in animation and Imagineering, would be creating original works that would play on every television, hang in every store, be featured on every wall and fictional billboard on Mickey Avenue, and especially in the gardens themselves. One of my favorite artists, Maggie Parr, was called in to create works that would be in the park and especially in the Disneyland Hotel. She had previously been contacted by the company to help create classical style works for the themed rooms in the Hotel Miracosta in Tokyo Disney Sea. Guests would be able to tell that the park had truly gone above and beyond to give them a one-of-a-kind experience. Yet this was only the beginning of Shanghai Disneyland. The next stop on our tour will be a look at the theme lands and how they were unique to China. Classic Disneyland rides and attractions had to be carefully thought out for their Chinese customers. In many regards, these classics had to be changed or adapted due to cultural traditions. Previously, this series had mentioned how the Haunted Mansion would have been taboo for Chinese guests. The afterlife was something not to be joked about. Honoring ancestors was a sacred tradition. Ghosts were to be feared. They could have been family that had been shamed by some slight on the mortal plane. For these reasons, Mystic Manor had to be developed for Hong Kong Disneyland. This new attraction captured the essence of the Haunted Mansion, but instead of celebrating the macabre, it celebrated magic and the Monkey King. Unlike the USA, the Chinese guests had no point of reference to classic attractions. They did not grow up watching Walt Disney on television. They did not necessarily see all of the animated shorts or feature films. They wouldn't be able to remember any of the catchy Sherman Brothers songs. Because of these reasons and more, Main Street was completely reconsidered. Mickey Avenue would be a good place to start teaching the guests about the mascots and their personalities. Each themed land would have to have the same makeover. If the land could not be adapted from its USA counterpart, then it would be completely revised and a new land would appear. This was something that Walt Disney had in the works for the Magic Kingdom in Florida. He wanted a chance to build a bigger and better Disneyland based on everything his team had learned. There were going to be many differences between the two parks. Unfortunately, Walt passed away, and many of those changes were pulled for fiscal reasons. Senior designer Mark Davis, who had helped develop Pirates of the Caribbean, the Haunted Mansion, and the Country Bear Jamboree, on top of being a master animator, was developing some new attractions for Florida. One of the biggest projects was the Western River Expedition. It would be a water attraction that would have replaced Pirates of the Caribbean. He noted that since the Legends of the Caribbean had been transplanted to the West Coast, then it only made sense to take a slice of the Old West and move it to the East. As Walt Disney World was being built, the stockholders and customers asked where the Pirates of the Caribbean was. This forced the Imagineers to scrap the Western River Expedition, much to the chagrin of Davis. Walt had given audiences a park that they didn't know they needed until the gates first opened. Davis wanted to continue that tradition and give visitors something different, but the stockholders had other plans. Elements of the Western River Expedition made it to Paris in the form of gags featured for the Phantom Manor and Thunder Mesa, the French counterparts for the Haunted Mansion and Big Thunder Mountain. Since Chinese guests had no point of reference for the traditional Disneyland attractions, it was a chance for the company to rewrite the book. Shanghai was going to receive a Tomorrowland. Many lands had a centerpiece, usually in the form of a mountain. Tomorrowland was no exception, yet visitors from the mainland had never heard of Space Mountain. At least in France, the company was able to re-theme the iconic white building to fit a turn-of-the-century Jules Verne aesthetic. The building and coaster would have been fun, but not exactly something that would have made sense to the locals. Tron, on the other hand, was a movie that audiences would have seen. It met the criteria for futurism and technology. The signature building for this land would be wrapped around a Tron coaster. The Tron Light Cycle Power Run would be balanced out by a spinning attraction loosely based on the technology featured in the film Tomorrowland. This spinning ride were the jetpacks. They were an updated version of the classic rocket jets. The Shanghai Tomorrowland was a fresh take on a concept. The two large attractions were actually built on an elevated platform. This would be the first land on any Disney resort that had a split-level design. These rides could be spotted easily from the new hub. They looked amazing in daytime, but even more so when illuminated at night. These were not the only things awaiting guests. On the first level, in the covered buildings, there would be a Star Wars launch bay and Marvel Universe meet and greet interactive attractions. An all-new interactive ride called Buzz Lightyear Planet Rescue would also help transport guests to another place. To help round out Tomorrowland, an interactive theater experience for young guests was also announced. Stitch Encounter was a theater based inside of Spaceship. Young guests would get to interact with the alien Stitch through the help of a cast member using a video screen. It was a similar concept used in the Turtle Talk attraction featuring Crush. This attraction, as well as Turtle Talk, had actually appeared in Tokyo Disneyland and Tokyo Disney Sea as well. The attraction first appeared in Hong Kong Disneyland in 2006. It then appeared in Paris in 2008 and Tokyo in 2015. The newest version for Shanghai was expected to use some updated technology and theming in its construction. Using and improving on existing technology helped get Disney parks to expand without necessarily creating a budget or logistical nightmare. The USA, Paris, Tokyo, and Hong Kong parks shared blueprints and ride technologies for a few attractions. There were some rides that were unique to each park, in keeping with the ideals of Walt Disney. But there were also repeat attractions in keeping with the wishes of investors. Did reusing attractions cheapen the Disney experience? It depends on who you ask. There were hundreds of Imagineers over the past few decades that had portfolios filled with thousands of ride concepts. They, and their fans, were certain that the Disney parks could be equally magical without ever reusing any attractions. Then again, there was business to consider. It cost time and money to bring a ride from concept to reality. There were hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, at stake. The company needed to make sure that every component that went into production would not only be a hit with audiences, but that it could survive non-stop operation year after year, regardless of foot traffic or weather. The Disney company did not have unlimited funds to make every wish a reality, even when Walt was alive. It was his brother Roy that helped keep the vision grounded. There would always be investors to answer to, and they lacked the confidence and vision that Walt was known for. Shanghai Disneyland would have vendors and contractors working for them, not only in construction of the park, but also for the ride technology itself. This was a sort of secret that Disney did not exactly go around advertising. To most park visitors, each ride and all the technology that went into them were born at Walt Disney Imagineering. That may have been true when Walt was in charge of WED Enterprises. The times, however, had changed. After Walt passed, there was a shakeup at the animation and Imagineering wings of the company. Some employees stayed and others were cut. Those that didn't get fired knew their time was marked and quit the company. A number of smaller companies sprang up and they developed new ride technology as well. Some were started up by former Disney Imagineers, others by designers that worked in parallel amusement attractions, such as arcades, haunted houses, and carnivals. There were even some startups, like Garner Holt Productions, GHP, that were founded because they were huge fans of Disneyland. Garner Holt was inspired at a young age by what he saw in the Pirates of the Caribbean, and especially the Haunted Mansion. He began designing his own haunted attractions and animatronics. He literally started his business out of his parents' garage. Companies like GHP began developing their own animatronics, robots, and dark ride technology. Some of the best elements featured in the Universal and Six Flags parks could now go toe-to-toe with the best that Disney had to offer because of Garner Holt and people like him. To be fair, many of the best modern Disney animatronics and theming were created by GHP as well. Sally Corp, for example, created the Battle for Metropolis 4D attraction at Six Flags. The ride featured life-size animatronics of some of the most popular DC heroes and villains. It also featured 3D animation and giant set pieces and props that could make any park envious. Even a relatively small company, such as Daniels Woodland, created full-size animatronics that rivaled the quality of the Cars vehicles at Disney's California Adventure. They started off creating tree houses and arcade target ranges and migrated into theme park attractions. When it came to creating themes and details, Disney could still be considered the pinnacle of the industry, and when it came to ride technology, there were sometimes partners that helped bring the attractions to life. One of the companies to help bring many of the early Disney attractions to life was Aerodynamics. They built the tracks and flumes for the Matterhorn bobsleds, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Haunted Mansion. They went on to build many coasters for other parks, but it was Disney that helped put them on the map. Chinese guests wanted to have a coaster experience that they could not have enjoyed at any other park. Disney needed a replacement for the Space Mountain coaster in Tomorrowland, and before the announcement of a Tron coaster, the company had considered using light cycles as the basis for a new attraction. Yet how would they be able to recreate the experience of riding a light cycle and make it thrilling for their guests? It turned out that there was a company that had actually held a patent on bike-style coasters. The Dutch company Vekoma had built a motorcycle-themed coaster. In fact, they had built a number of attractions where riders straddled a coaster car. In some cases, the carts were shaped like a horse or jet ski. One of their trademark motorcycle coasters was actually in the Chimelong Happy World Paradise. It was possible that the planners at Disneyland in China rode it a few times in order to get a sense on how it could be incorporated and improved upon for the Tron coaster. Vekoma had the patents for a quick launching system that gave them a smooth yet high-speed thrill ride. Of course, they also figured out how to keep the passengers from flying off the bikes without the use of traditional lap bars, seat belts, or shoulder harnesses. The Disney company may have used ride technology that was off the shelf for several attractions. However, the final product was far from anything that could be bought pre-made. This new coaster for Shanghai would be using a similar track layout and ride technology from Vekoma, however the similarities ended there. The new coaster would be covered by a curved glass dome that looked amazing in the daylight and had a superstructure that would be illuminated with rows of colorful lights to make it even more amazing at night. This was not only an aesthetic choice, but it also allowed the ride to operate during rainy weather. Remember that Shanghai was still on the edge of the monsoon belt. The other major difference for the Tron coaster and all other motorcycle coasters was that only half of it would be above ground. In this case, above the second level of Tomorrowland. The rest of the coaster would run through a show building. Inside this building, the Imagineers would recreate the famous grid or electronic world of Tron. These sights and sounds would truly immerse audiences in the experience of the film. There was no other attraction in the world that came close to offering this type of experience. The Imagineers were also responsible for completely redoing the cycles themselves. The vehicles that Vekoma created appeared more like mini street bikes than full-size motorcycles. Disney wanted to give audiences the sensation of being on an actual light cycle and not a miniature prop. They had created bikes that retained the basic shapes from the film, yet still provided a comfortable and safe ride. These new bikes would be sleek, with lighting effects on the body and wheels. They were careful in their design and seamlessly masked the shin and foot guards for the rider's safety. The mirror-smooth black finish made these coasters appear identical to those featured in the film. No detail was overlooked. The back riser, which kept riders in the seat, would receive a makeover as well. Riders were visiting the grid, and as such, they were assigned an identity disc. In the films, these were worn on the back. Replica discs were placed on the back of the seat riser and illuminated just as they were in the film. Some might consider this a throwaway detail, but these were also the things that separated Disney Imagineering from any other design group. Tomorrowland was not the only place receiving a makeover. In the next stop, the Pink Monorail will look at the elements that made Shanghai Disneyland different from the other theme parks in China. A few decades ago, China had a fair number of gardens and amusement parks to entertain the public. By 2015, China had become saturated with them, many of which were subpar experiences, but some of which were also of a high caliber. The Pink Monorail had stopped by Ocean Park, Happy Valley, and Fantawild previously in our series, Many of these parks offered unique experiences which found an audience of every age group. The Chinese parks were often a hybrid of the coaster park and the theme park, with multiple lands. Some of these locations combined classic garden with aquarium, zoo, and water parks. They were perfect destinations for families all year long. People in China learned to appreciate the parks that provided a diversity of attractions, and moreover, well-made attractions in parks that were maintained regularly. They also discovered that consistent theming from land to land helped create an immersive experience. Roller coasters seemed to be more appreciated if they had some sort of story. The Chinese found vendors from all over the world to build the attractions. They did not enter the theme park boom alone. They found investors from Russia and overseas that were willing to bet on the expanding middle class. Together, they created some very beautiful parks. Many of these parks would be enviable to any major city around the world. The thing that was lacking in all of these newly constructed parks was very subtle. It was the thing that Disney had spent a decade in China trying to perfect. In historical context, the Disney company had been chasing this element for over 65 years. The Disney Company was founded by a natural-born storyteller. Walt Disney knew what worked and what didn't, and he surrounded himself with brilliant people that could turn his vision into a reality. When he was planning Disneyland, he wanted each land, each section of the park, to tell a story. He wanted audiences to feel like the stars of the story. Using his experience in filmmaking, he wanted to stage each land and make guests feel as if they had walked onto a living movie set. It was a real place with real cast members, and they were there especially for the guest. Walt spared no expense in trying to bring each attraction and each land to life. This translated to the artists and Imagineers doing a tremendous amount of research. If it meant multiple trips to the LA Zoo and meeting with zoologists in order to create realistic robots of African wildlife, then they did it. If it meant learning the cultures and stories of Pacific Islanders, then they would do their homework. The sculptors and animators, who incidentally worked on Disney live-action projects, had to make sure that they could create huts, weapons, and totems that convinced Disneyland visitors that they had been transported to the other side of the world. The reality was that 1950s America was somewhat isolated and culturally insensitive. Walt always looked for a way to celebrate the things that made every culture unique. He wanted to broaden our appreciation of the people from around the world. You don't have to look further than It's a Small World for proof of this. The Imagineers learned to build on this understanding and try to wean themselves off of cultural jabs and instead create something that honored diversity. It wasn't done overnight. In the 60s and 70s, they were still going through heavy-handed portrayals of minorities in film, animation, and theme park design. But that changed over the years, especially after Walt passed away. The Imagineers learned to tell a story and not at the expense of different ethnic groups. The appreciation of a culture or a people was something that not every theme park designer understood. There was a fine line between creating an homage to a culture and parodying it. In their rush to create a travel destination, some of the parks in China did not make this distinction. The vendors and partners they worked with knew that it was important to tell a story, to bring the audience into the world they were fabricating. Unfortunately, the world they created around the attraction was only skin deep. There was no substance to the themed lands in places like Happy Valley and Fantawild. The buildings, attractions, and even parades were well made, but fans may have called it the Disney magic. Chinese tourists were learning that size and spectacle wasn't everything to the theme parks. Shanghai Disneyland would help them make that realization thanks to the addition of an entirely new land. Adventure Isle was a mysterious land that appeared seemingly overnight. It was a long-lost civilization that had been recently discovered and was open for guests to explore. What happened to the tribes that had made this place their home? Where did they disappear to? What stories did this land hold for guests? These things would be revealed little by little as audiences explored the new area. The Disney Company always had a talent for taking visitors on an exotic trip. It began with Adventureland in the original Disneyland. This land was inspired in part by the Disney nature films. It was over 60 years old, but probably more popular now than it ever was. What it taught Imagineers was something universal. The appeal of a lost continent, an ancient civilization possibly filled with mysterious tribes, was something that appealed in every major city. It often reminded guests of their ancestry, where some places were literally built on the ruins of a previous civilization, and in some places of the world, the ancient tribes and their customs still existed. Adventureland began the trend, but it was expanded upon at Walt Disney World, at Disneyland Paris, and at Tokyo Disneyland. Tokyo actually created two unique locales with Adventureland and the Lost River Delta at Tokyo Disney Sea. The exotic got a double treatment in Hong Kong as well, thanks to Adventureland and the slightly refined Mystic Point. Shanghai would get something completely unique as well. Adventureland was out, and Adventure Isle was the new wild destination. The planning behind Adventure Isle was inspired. The Imagineers managed to hide the attractions in plain sight, blending the rides right into the natural motif. Unlike the other lands, this corner of Disneyland focused on 3 large distinct attractions instead of multiple small ones. An updated version of the flying theater experience called Soarin' Over the Horizon would be hosted here. There would also be an activity place for families to climb over, crawl under, and otherwise explore, known as Camp Discovery. There would also be a stage show which combined classical Chinese acrobats with the story of Tarzan. The show would be called Tarzan, Call of the Jungle. In this main story of Tarzan from the animated feature would be retold. Traditional performers using juggling, acrobatics, and tumbling routines would play the roles of the creatures in the forest, as well as the jungle itself through some elaborate costumes. Call of the Jungle would be a unique hybrid stage show, combining the theater techniques of the West with the choreography of the East. I cannot recall any other show that created a narrative from 2 completely different cultures, as well as an animated film. Of course, a stage show was only part of the reason why guests would want to visit Adventure Isle. The largest attraction blended right into the atmosphere of the jungle. An enormous mountain rose to the heavens and would become a landmark for the surrounding area. The Roaring Rapids would actually be the latest addition in a legacy almost as old as Disneyland itself. Part of the Disney magic were things that could not be experienced in any other park. While there were still some fantastic designers working on attractions and dark rides outside of the company, what they created sometimes lacked a special element. In several Disney attractions, that element was a twist, something that riders did not expect. The first ride to start this tradition was the Matterhorn bobsleds. The mountain itself was an amazing feat of engineering. It was 147 feet tall and scaled down to accurate proportions of the real Matterhorn in the Swiss Alps. The Imagineers used forced perspective by planting smaller trees further up the steel and concrete mountain to make it appear much taller than it actually was. It was the first attraction in the world to feature steel tube tracks. Riders expected a fun ride, sledding down a mountain. What they did not expect was having an abominable snowman chasing them along the way. Disney teased guests in the queue with the legends of the abominable snowman and even had a cast from a footprint not far from the mountain. As riders were pulled to the top of the hill, they could make out a roar just above the howling winds. Surely they were just hearing things. That was until the coaster turned and put guests face to face with the monster itself. The rest of the attraction was a high-speed chase to stay ahead of the creature. Until that point, coasters had not been used to tell this type of story. It would be the first of many changes that Walt introduced to the industry. The Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World received copies of the classic Disneyland attractions. One that it never got was the Matterhorn. Although, to be fair, the lessons that the company learned from the dual track system of the Matterhorn went into the version of Space Mountain that they received. The version of Space Mountain in Disneyland opened a few years later and had only 1 track in its design. The Imagineers working on expansions to Walt Disney World never forgot what an amazing attraction the Matterhorn was. When Disney's Animal Kingdom was announced, they began working on a ride that would be like the Matterhorn, but on steroids. Veteran Imagineer Joe Rohde was responsible for the lands and attractions. He did an insane amount of research and planning in Expedition Everest, the legend of the Forbidden Mountain. He incorporated artifacts and architecture from his team trips to Nepal. The highlight of the queue were the artifacts that made up the Yeti Museum. The Yeti was a legendary monster from the Himalayas, predating even the abominable snowmen. Rhodey had expanded on absolutely every lesson the classic Disneyland attraction had taught him. After 6 years in planning and construction, the attraction was not only the tallest mountain of all the Disneyland parks, it ended up being the most expensive coaster they had ever built as well. In fact, at $100 million, it was the most expensive coaster in the world. The animatronic monster that awaited guests was 25 feet tall, many times larger than the abominable snowman animatronic in Disneyland. The figure was so massive, in fact, that after a few months in use, it had to be shut down. The forces that the robot generated as it moved back and forth began causing structural harm to the ride itself. This was a surprise to the many engineers that worked on the attraction. They had run stress tests on the material that went into each ride. They planned for the humid weather of Florida, the constant rainstorms, the water table, the precipitation of the ground, the addition of a steel and concrete superstructure. They even calculated the electronic and pneumatic forces that the giant animatronic would require. What they did not seem to have anticipated was that the Yeti would actually be strong enough to shake the entire mountain to its core. The foundation that the Yeti rested on did not properly cure. It began to break due to a miscalculation in the software that the engineers used. If the animatronic had not been shut down, it would have torn down the tower that it rested on and part of the track. To this day, Imagineers are looking for a way to fix the attraction without having to completely shut down the ride and peel away layers of rock and steel. Rhodey promised that the Yeti would be up and running someday. Expedition Everest was a sight to behold, just as the Matterhorn was before it. What Disney had in store for Shanghai would live up to a most impressive legacy. The company had to steer clear of anything that reminded guests of the Himalayas, especially Tibet. China had claimed Tibet was part of the nation, but the people of Tibet had been vying for independence for more than 50 years. The Roaring Rapids was far removed from any Yeti or snowman. It was conceived as a rafting attraction. Disney had built several amazing ones over the years, including the Grizzly River Run at Disney California Adventure and the Kali River Rapids at Animal Kingdom. What separated the Roaring Rapids from the other two was more to do with the fantastic. The other rafting attractions told a story, but the one planned for Shanghai was closer in tune with the Matterhorn. The archaeologists that had dug paths through the mountain looking for fossils and clues as to what had happened to the original inhabitants of Adventure Isle seemed to have awoken an ancient monster. Legend tells of an enormous monster named Korak, perhaps the last living dinosaur on Earth. Visitors that rode this new attraction would actually get up close to the enormous reptile. It was one of the biggest animatronics that the company had ever built and was more fearsome than the Yeti. While planning for this attraction, the Imagineers actually took field trips to Chinese archaeological digs. They met with paleontologists and went over fossil records of the hundreds of rare dinosaurs discovered in the mainland. The Imagineers figured out a system that would allow them to perform maintenance on this new enormous animatronic, even on a nightly basis, without having to shut down the attraction for extended periods of time. If you look carefully at the rock that Korak was perched on, it was actually an access point for the internal mechanisms of the animatronic. Also, its tail backed into a tunnel that could be accessed by a maintenance crew. If only the company had planned something similar for the Yeti. When guests got a chance to see Korak, it would be the talk of the town and the amusement industry. The level of detail that Disney had gone to in developing the new lands for Shanghai was superior to anything attempted by the competition. In fact, they were continuing to give guests unexpected twists in their rides. This was something that few other manufacturers had even conceived. But as the old saying goes, the best was yet to come. In the next and final stop, the Pink Monorail, we'll see how the company turned a beloved dark ride into an entire themed land. A special shout out to our sponsor circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxillume, a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She creates scents that capture the season, nature, or wonderful memories. She also takes commissions for larger orders, such as weddings or company gifts. It turns out that Nicole is also a huge Disney fan and has a line called Circa 1955. She creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. She creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every one scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell right. Don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15. That's PINK15 to get 15% off your purchase. Support a small company that also gives back to the community. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting Pink Monorail on his podcast network. Pink Monorail features Shelley and Alice. My name is Noah, and I'm filling in for the China series. The Jim Hill Podcast Network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm with Dan Zer, The Disney Dish with Len Testa, Hey Len, what's up? I Want That with Shelley, Marvel Us Disney with Aaron Adams, and Fine Tuning with Drew Taylor. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast. Have a great day.